Wilbur Evans Jr., otherwise known as Will, was born and raised in Boston. Upon graduating from Boston English High School, he went on to serve in the United States Army during the Vietnam War era. After being honorably discharged from the Army, Will enrolled in school at UMass Boston, and in 1978 he graduated with a bachelor's degree in economics. In 1979, Will started his insurance career working for Aetna Life and Casualty Insurance Company as an outside property insurance adjuster, and was responsible for the complete development and disposition of personal and commercial lines claims. In 1996, Aetna was purchased by Travelers Insurance Company, where Will worked as a property technical specialist. In 2003, Will took a position as a claims examiner with AIG, American International Group, supervising adjusters throughout the country. He was promoted to a major loss examiner, where he specialized in public entities, healthcare, and higher education, and was responsible for large, complex claims. Will received his Associates in Insurance Claims and Associates in Insurance Services from the Insurance Institute of America. He also attended classes at the Aetna Institute and Travelers Institute in Hartford, Connecticut. He received certificates in commercial building damage estimating, property claims skills, arson investigation, business interruption, flood damage, windstorm damage, earthquake damage, and attended many other schools and seminars. Will served on catastrophe teams throughout the country over the years and earned insurance adjusters' licenses in 28 individual states. As an insurance professional, he was required to take continuing education courses, assist adjusters, participate in mediations, and testify as an insurance expert in court. Some of the claims Will adjusted include the 9/11 World Trade Center attack at Ground Zero in New York, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Superstorm Sandy in New York, the Boston Marathon bombing, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas, and the Camp Wildfire in Paradise, California. In April 2020, after 41 years in the insurance business, Will retired from AIG as a major loss examiner. In this Management Achievement Program event, Mr. Evans presents on his experience preparing large, complex claims for catastrophic events such as 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, the Boston Marathon bombings, Superstorm Sandy, the Camp Wildfire in California, and more.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Evans, and it is great to be back at UMass Boston. This afternoon, I want to talk about how UMass gave me an opportunity to attend college and prepare me for my career in the insurance industry. And the main thing I want to talk about today is my experience at Ground Zero after the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center in New York and the impact 9/11 had on the insurance industry. Let's start with when I was in high school, attending Boston English High School. I received a good education, but I didn't receive any preparation for the SATs. I went down one Saturday, took the SATs, and after that, I didn't think anything about it until after I graduated from high school and applied for college. I was told that I was not eligible for college because my SAT scores were too low. Back in the 70s, colleges and universities used the SATs to determine one's ability to be successful in college. However, UMass Boston determined that they should consider other factors, and they gave me an opportunity to attend UMass Boston, where I had a very successful college career and majored in economics. UMass also prepared me for my career in the insurance industry by giving me confidence that I could compete with anyone in the workforce. And they encouraged me not to give up and to seek help wherever possible. And that reminds me of when I first received a promotion to I was initially in the complex claim unit, and I received a promotion into the major loss unit. And One of the first, most difficult claims that came across my desk was a claim for an oil explosion at an explosion at an oil refinery in Texas. I knew all about the policy. I grabbed the policy, read the policy, was comfortable with what was covered under the policy, but I didn't know which experts to engage. I knew I needed a cause and origin expert to determine what caused the explosion. I knew I needed a specialist who could estimate the cost to repair the damage. And I knew I needed a forensic accountant to determine the loss of business. So I reached out to an experienced examiner down in Houston, Texas, who gave me a lot of help. He gave me a list of experts to use in this type of situation. And he left his door open to me, saying, if I needed any help, I had any questions, I could contact him. So it was very valuable that I understood that help was always available. You just had to find it. Another thing, UMass prepared me to take exams. Now, once I got into the insurance industry, we were constantly tested on our knowledge. And by majoring in economics, I understood that businesses were looking at the bottom line and they were looking at the stock market. But next, we're going to go over the history of 9/11. And when I say 9/11, I'm always referring to September 11th, 2001. Okay, so we're going to go over a brief history about the terrorist attack in the United States, the hijacked planes, and the timeline. This is a picture of the Twin Towers before 9/11. The World Trade Center was opened on April 4th, 1973, and was a large complex with 7 buildings. This is a picture of the North Tower on fire with a second plane approaching the South Tower. On September 11th, 2001, at 8:45 a.m., the first plane crashed into the 80th floor of the 110-story North Tower. And 18 minutes later, the second plane crashed into the South Tower. And this picture here reminds me of one of the claims I had when I was working at Ground Zero. I received a claim from an insured who she owned a condominium right across from the Twin Towers, and she was starting a new business as a consultant. What her job was, she was going to help new entrepreneurs start businesses. So I went to visit her in her condo to look at whatever damage was up there. And as I was looking at the damages, she pulled out 2 or 3 boxes. And she said, I would like to include these boxes in my claim. And I said, well, what's in the boxes? So she opened up the boxes and she said, these are the brochures for my new business. So as I pulled the brochure out and opened it up, on the front of her brochure, she had a picture of the Twin Towers with a plane approaching it. She said, well, you know, I can't use this brochure with my business. And I said, yes, I understand you cannot use those. But then I had to put on my adjuster's hat and say, yeah, but is there any damage to the brochures? There was no damage to the brochures, and she was quite upset with me at that time. So I said, let's get through the rest of the claim, and then we can see where we stand. So after I went through all the rest of her damage and came up with a bottom line figure for her claim, she was very happy with the bottom line figure. So she wasn't concerned about the brochures. She was just happy we got the claim settled and I was able to move on. On September 11th, 2001, there was a terrorist attack at the World Trade Center in New York, which killed about 3,000 people. This was a part of a series of coordinated attacks in the United States on September 11th. During that morning, 2 planes were hijacked from Boston Logan Airport and crashed into the Twin Towers in New York. 1 plane was hijacked from the Washington Dulles International Airport and was crashed into the Pentagon building in Virginia. And another plane was hijacked from Newark International Airport, was crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. As a result of the attack at the World Trade Center, where many people lost their lives, there was also extensive destruction of property where I was involved as an adjuster. Next, I want to go over a timeline of what happened the morning of 9/11. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane crashed into the North Tower. At 9:03 a.m., the second plane crashed into the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., the third plane crashed into the Pentagon building in Virginia. And at 9:45 a.m., all air travel was shut down in the United States. All planes were ordered to land immediately, and if you didn't land, you were subject to being shot down by military fighter jets. And at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsed. At 10:03 a.m., the fourth plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. They said this plane was headed for either the White House or the Capitol building before the passengers brought the plane down. And at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower collapsed. I just wanted to go over that timeline just to give you an idea of all the things that happened within a 2-hour period on the morning of September 11th. And that is why this country will never forget 9/11. As an adjuster, I was responsible for inspecting the property damage, writing estimates to repair the damage, calculating the loss of business income, and settling the claim. I was assigned to adjust insurance property claims at Ground Zero for 2.5 months. I arrived in New York on October 1st, 2001, and completed my catastrophe duty on December 15, 2001. One of the reasons I was selected to work at Ground Zero was because of my experience handling business interruption claims. I had taken many classes in business interruptions, received many certificates, and I taught a class to the adjusters at Travelers Insurance Company. This is one of the first photos I took when I arrived inside Ground Zero. When I first arrived at Ground Zero, the entire area was fenced in, and we were required to meet at a checkpoint to receive a police escort into the area to inspect the property damage. In this photo, you can see the cranes in the middle of the photo, and they're standing over the area where the Twin Towers used to stand. Look to the right of the photo, you can see a building. It looks like a melted building. That was 5 World Trade Center. And on the left, you can see surrounding buildings that had damage. And when I arrived there 3 weeks later, you can still see the smoke in the area, which reminds me of the first claim I handled when I arrived at Ground Zero was at a pizza shop down the street from where the Twin Towers stood. When I went to meet the owner of the pizza shop, he informed me that on the day the towers collapsed, there was a cloud of smoke with debris coming down the street. And there were hundreds of people running away from that area. He told me he opened up his doors to his pizza shop and let in as many people as possible before the big cloud of smoke and debris came to his shop. He let in as many people as he could until he finally had to close his door. And once he closed his door, a few minutes later, everything went dark when that cloud of smoke, debris went by his pizza shop. And he told me, he said the only thing he regretted was that he couldn't allow more people in his pizza shop. Now keep in mind, this pizza shop was a small, probably a 20-foot by 20-foot shop with a basement. So he packed as many people as he could inside that pizza shop and did the best he could. And one last thing, as an adjuster, you're responsible for hiring experts and specialists. They could include cause and origin experts, contractors, lawyers, engineers, accountants, restoration companies, and other specialists. Just to let you know, as I walked around this area, there were rescue workers working around the clock. There were lines of trucks removing debris from the area. And there were thousands of spectators behind the fenced area trying to get a peek inside Ground Zero. And it was thick white ash covering a lot of the property. And there were contractors constantly cleaning the area. This is a photo taken from the rooftop of a condominium where some adjusters were living. Insurance companies rented condos from unit owners who did not want to stay in the area. And as you look down, you can see the buildings that some of them are covered with screens, and there's a hotel over on the right, which reminds me of one of the claims I handled inside the Millennium Hotel. I received a claim inside the hotel for a flower shop that was in the lobby. So when I went over to the hotel, went inside, I found out that this was the hotel that the Red Cross has used to set up for the police, firemen who were working at Ground Zero. They set up an area where police and firemen could come and either get something to eat, or they could even go up into one of the rooms to rest. And when I was in the hotel, I looked up on the wall, and there were a lot of cards that were sent to the fire and policemen from around the world. There were cards from elementary school students thanking the police and firemen for protecting America. This is a map showing the locations of the 7 buildings at the World Trade Center. Adjusters use this map to help identify the buildings. As you can see, if you can see, the buildings are identified by the number of stories for each building. This is a picture of the travelers' catastrophe vans. These vans travel around the country wherever there is a catastrophe. The vans are used as an office for insureds to meet adjusters, receive advance payments, and discuss their insurance claims. This is a picture of the catastrophe van in Manhattan. I'm standing in front of the CAT van, which shows the stickers of all the locations where the van traveled for catastrophes. You can see at least 25 stickers on the CAT van. And many insureds came to the CAT van to receive advance payments so that they could have money to do restoration at their businesses. Next, I would like to go over some of the additional issues that the adjusters had to deal with in New York at Ground Zero. The first was the air quality. Many residents and adjusters were complaining about the air quality down at ground zero. So the government came in and ran tests on the air, and they informed us that the air quality was safe and that we could continue working. So as adjusters, we went back to work. There was asbestos concerns. Back in the 70s, the Twin Towers were built with asbestos, which was used as a fire retardant. And later on, we found out that asbestos was bad for your health and could possibly cause cancer. And there was an anthrax scare. Someone turned an envelope over to the New York Police Department claiming that this envelope had anthrax, which is a poisonous powder that could cause sickness or even death. And as we were working in the area, it was always a terrorist fear. People didn't know if we were going to have another attack. And then there was the orange and blue smoke. There was orange and blue smoke in the area. And again, the adjusters and the residents were concerned about it. But again, the government came in, tested the orange and blue smoke, and said that the orange and blue smoke was not harmful to you. So one of our adjusters was dealing with a claim with an elderly man. And the elderly man was concerned about the orange and blue smoke. So the adjuster told him that the smoke was not harmful and it was tested by the government and he had nothing to worry about. But this elderly man's response, he says, I may not be a rocket scientist, but he said, there's no way you can tell me that smoke is not bad for you. And then in the middle of things, in the middle of November, there was a plane crash at LaGuardia Airport in Queens, New York. The first thing people thought was another terrorist attack. So the entire city of New York was shut down for half a day until they completed the investigation and determined that this was just an accident. And the fact that we were working in a crime scene, we always had to be concerned about where we went and what we did. And of course, the media was everywhere. Every time you turned around, the media was looking for a story. And we were told as adjusters that we had to be careful what we said and what we did, because we could end up on the front page of the New York Times. In fact, one of the adjusters did end up on the front page of the New York Times with the heading, "First the insured gets screwed by the terrorists. Now the insured is being screwed by the insurance company." So we had to be very careful with the media. And then we had the emergency restoration companies. Normally, when we deal with restoration companies, we meet with them and we agree on the cost to clean up. Because this was an emergency situation, we used what we call the honor system and just asked the restoration companies to keep track of the time you spend cleaning up and the material used. And of course, you can imagine what happened. When we started receiving the invoices, many of them were outrageous, and we had to sit down and negotiate a reasonable cost for cleanup with the restoration companies. And finally, the unions. New York is a union state. So most of the repairs had to be done by union contractors, which as an adjuster, I had no issues with. I mean, my only concern was that they did shut out a lot of the non-union contractors. But one day, it was getting close to the end of November, early December, we decided to put some Christmas lights on our catastrophe van. So as we were out there hanging Christmas lights on the catastrophe van, a man walked up to us and asked us, "What are you doing?" And we just said, "Well, we're putting Christmas lights on the catastrophe van." And he says, "Well, I don't do your job, so why are you doing my job?" So we didn't understand what he was talking about at first, but then he explained. He says, whenever you want to do any type of electrical work, even hanging lights on a van, you need to contact the union for them to send out a union electrician to hang the lights. He says, "I know you all not from around, you all are not from around here, so I'm gonna give you a break, but don't let it happen again." I took this picture. It shows the bottom of the Freedom Tower, just over to the right. It's hard to see the top because of everything looks like a mirror, so you just see mirrors, a picture of the other buildings. But my wife and I visited the Freedom Tower in 9/11 Museum on May of 2017. And this was my first time back in that area since 2001. The Freedom Tower replaced the two twin towers. And if you look over to the left, you see that black square. That's a memorial pool, which is a tribute of remembrance, honoring the people killed in the terrorist attack at the World Trade Center. The names of people killed are inscribed on the bottom parapet surrounding the twin memorial pools. This is a picture of the World Trade Center today. During my final days working at Ground Zero, there was a big difference in the area. Some businesses were able to reopen, and the area became more accessible to the public. I was proud and honored to be able to assist the victims of this tragedy. I know many people who wanted to come down and help, but they were not allowed in the area. I was grateful for the opportunity to work at Ground Zero and feel that I made a contribution to New York and to this country's recovery. And finally, I'd like to go over the 9/11 impact on the insurance industry. As a result of 9/11, there were many issues that impacted the insurance industry. There were dozens of insurance companies that provided coverage at the World Trade Center. Some insurance companies were having serious financial issues because of 9/11. This was the worst insurance disaster in history at that time. As claims were estimated at $40 billion. And insurance companies were struggling to recoup losses. Reinsurance saved some insurance companies. So insurance companies were set to increase premiums by 20%, which most businesses couldn't afford. So the government had to get involved with terrorism insurance. The Terrorist Risk Act was passed to share losses between the federal government and the insurance industry. They had to do this because premiums were becoming too high to cover this risk. Many insurance companies had to change the occurrence limit of liability language in their policy. The occurrence limit of liability provides coverage up to a stated limit in the policy. The World Trade Center Twin Towers had an insurance policy with an occurrence limit of liability of around $4 billion. The estimated cost to rebuild the Twin Towers was approximately $8 to $9 billion. The World Trade Center, Twin Towers were underinsured. And there was no co-insurance clause in the policy. How many of you heard about the $4 billion lawsuit filed against the insurance companies. You can go to the chat room and answer if you heard about this lawsuit. The owners of the Twin Towers filed a $4 billion lawsuit against the insurance companies, claiming this was two separate claims, and therefore they should be entitled to two separate policy limits, totaling $8 billion. Their position was that there were two planes, they hit two separate buildings at two separate times. However, the insurance company's position was that this was one claim based on the language in the policy. The occurrence limit of liability provides coverage for one loss or series of losses arising out of one event. And this was considered one event. This includes continuous or repeated exposure. Go to the chat room and let me know if you think this should be considered one or two events. But I tell you, it took 5 years in court to resolve this issue. In fact, about 3 years after 9/11, I was in New York on another claim, and I was at an attorney's office. And as lunch came around, he asked me if I wanted to go to the courthouse to check on the status of the 9/11 lawsuit. I said, of course. So we walked over to the courthouse, and as we entered the courthouse, we had to go through the metal detector, and then we were required to check our cell phones at a separate desk. They did not allow any cell phones in the courthouse, in the courtroom. So as we went inside the courthouse, into the courtroom, the first thing I noticed were about 40 people sitting down in the courthouse with laptops open in front of them. I later found out that these were lawyers, all lawyers representing either insurance companies or insureds or people who had policies, insurance policies in the area. So as I looked up at the front of the courthouse, up on the wall, there was a huge 8 by 10 foot picture up on the wall with a picture of an insurance policy with certain words highlighted in yellow. So as I looked over to the left, and I could see a man sitting in the witness stand. And he was being questioned by one of the lawyers. And the lawyer was asking him to explain the wording in the policy, what it meant, what the intent was. And I later found out that this was one of the underwriters from one of the insurance companies involved. And as I looked at the underwriter in the witness stand, I could see sweat on his forehead just pouring out. This man was under a lot of pressure. And he was not only going to be questioned by the lawyer who was questioning him at the time, but all the lawyers who had an interest in this case would have an opportunity to question him. So as I said, it took about 5 years to finally resolve this issue. And what happened is that when the case went before the first judge ruled that this was one occurrence, and therefore the owners of the Twin Towers were entitled to one policy limit. But the owners appealed that decision, and it went to an appeals court judge. And he ruled that this was two occurrences. So that was appealed. And the next appeals judge said it was one occurrence. And then that was appealed. Next judge said two, then one. This went back and forth for 5 years until they finally decided that we needed to resolve this issue. And both sides agreed to a compromise agreement. Anybody guess what the agreement was? Well, I'm going to tell you. After 5 years of litigation, both sides agreed to call this 1.5 occurrence. And that resolved the issue. Next, I'm going to open the floor to questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
Question.
In the chat, it says, I have a question about the firefighter and police officer's health.
Okay, the question is, there's a question on how the firefighters and the police officers are doing, how their health is. If you've been following.
Asked that question because I saw in the news they're still fighting for healthcare rights because they were exposed to asbestos, and they kind of are still getting denied a little bit. I don't know if that's the insurance or is that just the government of the state of New York who is dealing with or denying that. So I was just wondering if you could clarify that a little bit.
Yes. This was the responsibility of the government to provide health care for the firefighters and the police. Initially, they set up a fund for the health of the police and firemen, but it was set up for a limited amount of time. And I think that time expired maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So there was a big complaint, and there was a big, I guess, issue with the firefighters and the police officers losing their health insurance. But after tremendous pressure on the federal government, they passed another bill allowing these firemen and police officers additional benefits. But many of them did get sick, and some of them even died.
The next question, has the event left an impact on you mentally? And if yes, explain how.
Well, initially, when I first came home, it did have an impact on me. But fortunately for me, I had a loving wife who was there to support me. And I was able to take time off to try to kind of digest what happened. And another thing that helped me was back in 2017, when I went down, and me and my wife went back to New York and visited the 9/11 Museum and the Freedom Tower to take a look at what was there today. And that was kind of closure for me to go back and see that everything was great. And, I mean, we had new buildings. New York was back in business, and things were almost back to normal at that time.
The next question, were you properly compensated for the quality of work that you put in? You don't have to.
Well, just speaking on that, we did receive extra pay for going down there. Whether or not you want to call it properly compensated, I won't answer that.
The reason why I asked this question is because people working during the restoration of Ground Zero suffered. Firemen suffered mentally, physically. There was cancer. And I asked the question because I don't know, being exposed, it may have long-term effects. So I asked that because I want to know if that was put into consideration in terms of taking care of you financially.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I didn't have any long-term effects at this time. I mean, I have an annual physical, so I try to stay on top of my health. And so far, I'm not having any ill effects, and no side effects or no effects from my time at 9/11. Also, when I was down there in New York at 9/11, they had me staying in Long Island at times, so I wasn't staying in the area constantly. We had an office in Long Island, New York, so I was staying at a hotel in Long Island, and then later on in an apartment because I was down there for so long. So I would have to take trips to Manhattan on the subway to go see my Iron Shores and to see other things down in that area. So fortunately for me, I wasn't down there constantly the whole time. I mean, I did spend some time down there. I did spend some time in a hotel in Soho when I first arrived, but for the most part, I was living in Long Island and just commuting back and forth. So I didn't have, so far, I didn't have any side effects.
Heather here, preliminary engagement. I am at the, we'll call it the MAP headquarters with Will and his wife, Margaret. But Will, you and I had an opportunity to talk about the work that you've done before this, and you had talked about other events that you had worked on that are well-known and catastrophic. Can you talk a little bit about those as well?
Yes, I can. Some of the other claims I had, and I'll get into a little more details in a minute, included Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Matthew, Superstorm Sandy, the Boston Marathon bombing, and the Camp Wildfire in Paradise, California. Let's start with the claim I had for the Boston Marathon bombing. Since we're here in Boston, and I guess many of you were around at that time and can probably relate to what was going on. After the Boston Marathon bombing, I received a claim for several of the hotels down on Berkeley Street, on Boylston Street, excuse me. And they were putting in a claim for business interruption. They were claiming that they lost business because the entire area was shut down and that they could not get any guests into their hotels. So as I looked into it further, I went down to meet with the managers of the hotel. And as we discussed things and as we were able to, I was able to get more information, I discovered that they didn't lose any money from loss of guests in the hotel rooms because every single one of their rooms were being occupied by the media. So the media actually filled all the rooms. So they didn't have a claim for loss of business from the rooms, but they did have a claim for extra expenses, which we did cover. Another claim I'll talk to you about is the Camp Wildfire in Paradise, California. This happened a few years ago, and I don't know if many of you heard about that claim. This was the wildfire that destroyed 90% of Paradise, California. The entire town was burnt down. And I had an actual claim in Paradise for a senior citizens elderly care center. As part of my specialty was healthcare, so that fell under my category, having a claim at this senior citizen healthcare facility. When I talked to the manager of the facility, he informed me that he received a call from a government official telling him that he had 45 minutes to evacuate all of the patients in the facility. He had about 90 patients in there. Many of them were on respirators and had other machines they were hooked up to. And they also told the manager that there were no ambulances available to help him. Fortunately, the manager was able to evacuate all 90 residents, and they were evacuated safely. Another interesting claim I had was for Hurricane Katrina. And because my field was dealing with higher education, we insured some colleges in the area. And I also dealt with municipalities, so we insured some of the government buildings in the area. So let's start with the college that we insured. How many of you heard of Dillard University? They're right downtown in New Orleans. During Hurricane Katrina, the entire campus was underwater. So they had to make arrangements for the students to travel around the country to continue their education at other colleges and universities. I'm not sure if any of them ended up coming here to UMass Boston, but I wouldn't be surprised. All the students spread out around the country so they could continue their education until they repaired the campus. So when they finally did repair the campus, all of the students, or most of the students, went back to complete their college education. And since we also had a claim with the New Orleans public schools, where I don't know how many of you ever heard of the No Child Left Behind Act that President Bush put into effect years ago. Well, anyways, the No Child Left Behind Act stated that all the students in the New Orleans public school or in any public school around the country were entitled to tutoring services if they needed it. So New Orleans hired this tutoring company to tutor the students in the New Orleans public schools. So the owners of the company filed a loss of business claim when all the schools were shut down because the entire city was shut down and they had no students to tutor. So they filed a claim with the insurance company that it was assigned to me. And after I reviewed the policy, I realized that they didn't have coverage for loss of business because they had canceled that coverage in the prior years. And that there was no coverage for their loss of business claim. And anytime we're talking about large losses where there's a dispute over coverage, typically there's a lawsuit. So they filed lawsuit against the insurance company claiming that they were entitled to loss of business claim because they had no students to tutor. And they took this particular claim to court. In fact, they went before a judge who had a jury trial to determine if they were entitled to recover their loss of business. I was required to first give a deposition prior to the lawsuit. And then I was required to testify in court about the language in the policy. And typically, when insurance companies have a claim in certain parts of the country, it's tough for them to win a claim because the lawyers always paint the picture of it's the big insurance company not wanting to pay the little guy. But in this case, it was two big companies. The company that was providing the tutoring service, they were a large company. And so as the trial went through, it was about probably a week-long trial. At the end of the trial, the jury agreed with the insurance company and said that there was no coverage for their business interruption claim because they actually canceled the coverage that provided that type of coverage a couple of years before this loss. So that was just one of the claims that I ended up having to go to court and testify. Now, Hurricane Matthew, that was another claim. I don't know how many of you remember a few years ago, Hurricane Matthew. It rained on the city of Houston. I think it rained for, seemed like a week straight. So the entire downtown area of Houston was flooded. And we insured quite a few hospitals downtown Houston. I don't know, most of you may know that the University of Texas, they have a large hospital in downtown Houston where they do a lot of cancer research. They tell me it's one of the largest in the country. So that hospital, along with many schools in the area, were flooded. And they either had damage to the buildings that had to be repaired or replaced, or they just had a loss of business claims. And then just about all of those claims, it did take years to settle, but they were all settled and insured was happy with the final settlement.
That actually is a great stopping point right there, because I know a lot of you have to get to class. Exactly, because we're in the same room. But I just wanted to thank Will and his wife, Margaret, for coming today. And Will, one last question. In about a minute or less, as we're wrapping up, can you give any advice to students that might be interested in this line of work?
Yes, I can. Many people, they don't even think about the insurance industry when they're looking for a career. But I can tell you that the insurance industry, they cover just about every field you can think of. You know, from accounting, which I understand there's a lot of accountants at this school, healthcare. I mean, whatever you can think of, they have that in the insurance industry. So I would suggest that if there's anybody interested in joining the insurance industry, that they should do some research and look into getting hired by an insurance company. Now, right now, most insurance companies are not doing a lot of training because they want somebody else to train you, and then they'll come in and hire you with they'll give you a raise and hire you. But because I worked at Travelers Insurance Company, I'm familiar with them and the fact that they have the Travelers Institute, and the Aetna Institute, used to be the Aetna Institute, but it's a Travelers Institute in Hartford, Connecticut, where when I was hired, they would have training twice a year. But now they do still have training, but it may be once a year, once every other year. So I would say that is one company you could look into if you're interested in trying to get your foot in the door. If you try to go to other companies, what I would suggest is that you just get yourself in the door, even if it's just an entry-level position, doing something that you may not want to be your final career. But once you get in the door, you get to meet the right people and you make connections, and then you can move around in the company, get promotions, and eventually get the position that you're looking for. But I highly recommend that people look into the insurance industry, because I always say that's the forgotten industry. And most people don't even think about it and just end up falling into it somehow. Like when I ended up getting a job at the insurance industry, I was just looking around for a career, and I had the opportunity to interview with an insurance company. And because I had a property background, it ended up fitting me where I was able to get in the door as a property adjuster, work my way up until I retired just recently.
Nice. All right. Thank you again, Will and Margaret. And thank you all for tuning in today.
And thank you for having me.